first myth being that armies fight wars. They don't. It's nations that fight wars. It seems to me the Ukrainian nation are in the fight for as long as it takes because this is an existential threat. The second myth, that you can win wars from afar just by dropping ordnance. You can't. And I think we sort of saw that really in things like the Vietnam War, for example, where rolling thunder and both the military potential and economic potential of the Americans vis-a-vis Vietnam was such that you'd have thought that they'd have surrendered years ago. And indeed, one might recall that every variable was fed into a computer in 1969 to ask the question, when will we win in Vietnam? And the answer came out, you won 5 years ago in 1964, because it's that variable about the will, which is the thing which is hardest to measure in warfare. So I don't think it's going to make any tangible difference on things. It's just this sullen way that the Russians go about destroying things.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1246 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're talking to retired Major General Chip Chapman. Now, General Chip is a former army commander and author of Notes from a Small Military, and your regular commentator on defence and security matters. Chip, it's great to have you back on Frontline.
Lovely to be here with you, Philip.
Now, it's been an interesting 72 hours. Russia, over that period, and in fact slightly before that, has been launching some of its most intense aerial assaults on Kyiv, using hundreds of drones, a large number of ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles. But from a tactical perspective, what's Russia trying to achieve with this? Is the barrage going to just terrorize the civilian population, or do you think there's a deeper military objective at play?
No, I don't think there's a deeper military objective. I think we've already had, during the war, you mentioned the 1,246 days, a number of or ifs from Putin. This is really trying to play into the Ukraine fatigue, I think, both from the perspective of the West and from the perspective of the Ukrainian population, to go along with those other or else moments that we've had with the politics of fear to do with the nuclear threats at various times, politics of food with the grain, and the politics of making sure that people had no energy to keep themselves warm in winters. However, I think we are seeing is both the mix, the frequency and the geography of the attacks are getting larger. And it's already, I think, 5 times in the last 6 weeks, we've gone from the largest drone attack to the one which occurred on the 8th of July, which was 728 real mix of ballistic missiles and the drones. And with this sort of propaganda they've also put out showing factories to go to sort of drone raids of 1,000 to 2,000 in the future. Now, rather like the Blitz in 1940-41, there's that sort of equation which I think you and I both kind of know, which is total means multiplied by your strength of will gives you the power of resistance. So certainly one aspect of this is to try and break the will to lessen the power of resistance of the Ukrainians. But rather like the Blitz in 40-41, there are also a number of material and non-material factors which mean that's unlikely to happen. The first one is that if you have what it was called a safe refuge or secure base as a material factor in the Blitz, i.e., really it's where you could go and hide in the tube, then you could recover quite quickly if you weren't getting hit on a daily basis with huge numbers. Now, although the numbers are large, they're not day after day after day. One of the other things which relates to that, it is quite easy to recover from fatigue if you don't have a day after day after day wave of attacks. The other third thing in terms of the Blitz was that as long as you have access to food, and that is consistent, that also is a material factor which sustains will. And fourthly is what was called conditioning in the Blitz, where if you've been hit by 300, 400, 500 drones, you get conditioned to that. So being hit by another 100 doesn't really mean that much. Of course, they're not being hit by that number because most of them are being knocked down. But the most important thing was actually the non-material factors, the belief in a better future, the belief in your leadership for the future, the belief that there will be a better world. And I think they still believe that in Ukraine. So do I think that this is likely to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table and offer the surrender peace, which Putin absolutely wants? I don't think that is so. And again, it's worth saying two things that Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in his 5 myths that we need to let go in 2017. The first myth being that armies fight wars. They don't. It's nations that fight wars. It seems to me the Ukrainian nation are in the fight for as long as it takes because this is an existential threat. The second myth, that you can win wars from afar just by dropping ordnance. You can't. And I think we sort of saw that really in things like the Vietnam War, for example, where Rolling Thunder and both the military potential and economic potential of the Americans vis-a-vis Vietnam was such that you'd have thought that they'd have surrendered years ago. And indeed, one might recall that every variable was fed into a computer in 1969 to ask the question, when will we win in Vietnam? And the answer came out, you won 5 years ago in 1964, because it's that variable about the will, which is the thing which is hardest to measure in warfare. So I don't think it's going to make any tangible difference on things. It's just this sullen way that the Russians go about destroying things rather than having an ability to knock over both the will and the government of Ukraine for the long term.
Yeah, people forget the importance of the moral component of fighting power and the way the people that are there, and that warfare is just an extension of diplomacy by other means. And if Russia stops fighting, the war stops. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ceases to exist from the Russian perspective, because they'll try and take over all of it. But it's not just the Russians that are flying drones at different targets. Ukraine conducted for them, it was significant, 43 drone strike on Rostov and other regions deep inside Russia. And in Rostov, they've hit a major railway station and railway hub over the last 24 hours. Are these Ukrainian strikes more significant, better targeted, and having more of a military effect on Russia's ability to continue to prosecute its conflict, and a psychological blow for the Kremlin?
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned just now, Philip, of course, the moral component. What we're really talking about here is Ukraine's ability and wish to knock out as much as they can of the physical component. Firstly, to stop things getting to the front, i.e. a railway hub, and secondly, to degrade the economic potential when they hit things like drone factories and things like that. So from their perspective, it's an imperative to do this. I think the problem with both sides is that we've never really seen in a campaign in history where a strategic bombing campaign, or the equivalent, which is what they're doing with the drones, has led to a decision all by itself. What it seeks to do really is to raise the costs in a pressure strategy for both sides. So you alter the cost benefit analysis, and hopefully from the Russian perspective or the Ukrainian perspective, and you bring the other side to the negotiating table where you create the favorable conditions for the outcome that you seek to achieve, which of course is always that political outcome. So it's sensible that the Ukrainians do what they're doing. Will it be decisive? No, I don't think it will, but it helps to shatter the illusion, I think, that Russia is a superpower, and at one stage may mean that they have to come to the table. I do think that in the interim, before we get to the end of Trump's 50 days, if we ever do, that the Russians will continue to hit Ukraine as much as they can. And I believe that there'll be that reciprocal attacking from the Ukrainians to try and alter that calculus. But again, I think we both understand that in terms of the political outcomes which each side seeks to achieve, they don't look at this through an economic prism where the leaders of each country, particularly Putin, he's not an accountant, he is not an economist, he's someone who has always sought this imperial revanchist Russia, and that was quite clear on his last phone call with President Trump. that he will not back down, that he does seek the demilitarization of Ukraine, that he does seek the denazification, as he sees it, of Ukraine. He does see that they need to see the root causes, which of course would take him back to either 1991 or 1997, with the sort of false myth of NATO expansion being something which was that he didn't cause, which of course he did. All those countries freely joined NATO to try and get real security. And again, that Russia should realize the territorialities as he sees them. And that is the impasse that we really see ourselves in at the moment, when neither Russia or Ukraine currently has much of an incentive to stop fighting. Ukraine refuses to surrender, and Russia seeks nothing less than the capitulation of Ukraine. None of those things are going to happen at the moment. So we haven't got a gap analysis in terms of negotiations, and there's this notion that they may recommence tomorrow, but I don't put much beyond a bit of confidence building measures in terms of some more prisoner exchanges. So it's not gap analysis at the moment, it's chasm analysis, and there's no way that can be breached at the moment, in my view.
Yeah, well, adding the chasm analysis, General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, the HUR, was reported in Ukraine's newspapers this morning as saying that Russia has got plans to expand its military, create 2 new military districts, a number of new military formations, and spend $1 trillion between now and 2036 in professionalizing and growing its military capability. Can it? Has it got the wherewithal? Is this just Russian pie in the sky?
Well, of course, like all things in war, there are too many variables to answer that. And particularly, rather like an economist, you should never give a time and a figure at the same time, one or the other. At the moment, NATO's view, of course, is that Russia will reach its zenith in terms of economic potential in 2027. After that period in time, there'll be a glide path down to stagflation and all the stuff that goes with that. But as I've said, there are so many variables because we don't ultimately know what the support from China might be. Wang Yi, in an unguarded moment a week or so ago, did say to Kaya Kallas, the EU EU foreign high representative, that China did not want to see Russia lose because the US may change all its attention and give all its attention to the Taiwan and the Chinese theatre. And at the same time, there's this notion that North Korea might provide another 30,000 troops alongside sustaining artillery. So there are just too many variables, including the variable that in the 50-day interregnum before Trump makes a decision, indeed, if he does that, of course, because that also gives 50 days for Putin to get at him. And there's no doubt that Putin would just try and like to do a deal of some sort with Trump, and that Zelensky and the broader West, Europe, really don't have any agency in this fight. So it's a figure that of the 2035. Do I think that Russia has that economic and military potential in that time frame? Only if it were to potentially win in Ukraine and it becomes a vassal state of Russia, because of course then you potentially would have the transference of a lot of resources. I don't think that would be the case though, because rather like in Machiavelli's words, if once you've tasted freedom, the ruler of a city can never sleep with his eyes fully shut.
I like that one. But again, Russia, when it comes to the front line, it's making small advances. Institute of Study of War has suggested that, whilst there's intense fighting continuing around Donetsk and the Sumy oblasts, both sides are making marginal gains. What's that telling us about the current state of the land war? And are we seeing signs that either side has got any capability to really make a breakthrough, whether it be this summer, whether it be next year, or in the future?
Well, I think what the Budanov has also said is that the notion of Russia achieving its operational objectives for 2025 are just not feasible. So capturing bits of Sumy and capturing Donetsk Oblast are just not feasible. What we are still seeing is Russia, the chicken pecking grain by grain, we see that in terms of territory, that Ukraine is losing slowly, and you could argue that that is an eroding stalemate. But again, the variable for the future in the next 2 months is what support will the US give, and how will that once again equalize the battlefield in the same way that, for example, in June 22, Ukraine was losing slowly, and the introduction of ATACMS and HIMARS equalized the battlefield there. So we still have this tactical problem for the Russians that it's very difficult at the moment to overcome the killing zone, the recce strike complex of how the Ukrainians are doing both their FPV drones allied to their artillery fires that go with it. So that recce strike complex that they're doing is very successful. And to look at two figures, and again, I don't give much credence to any linear figures because war doesn't necessarily progress in a linear fashion. But on the 9th of July, for example, the Economist figure then was that at the current rate of advance, it would take until February 28 for Russia to complete the military annexation, as it were, of the four oblasts that they're currently in. And if the current rate of advance, it would also take until 2256 for Ukraine to conquer for Russia to conquer all of Ukraine with 101 million casualties. Now, of course, that linear projection on that final figure is absolutely absurd. There's no nation on earth that could do that. But that would bring us again to what is a acceptable or unacceptable price for Russia to pay. And of course, it was around December, I think, that Putin said that only victory or defeat are the two acceptable things, and it's victory that he seeks. And therefore, the only way for the current regime to have victory is to plow on with the forever war. Now, then is also of course, one of the theories of victory of the Russians. And in a sense, Medinsky was setting the framework for that. And some of the things he said at the last Istanbul negotiations on the 2nd of June around there, when he quoted the obscure war with Sweden from 1700 to 1721 with the notion that we can fight for 2, 3, 4 years, you'll get tired of this, we won't. So that still remains, I think, the theory of victory for the Russians, not we can plow on until 2256 with 101 million casualties, because that is absurd. So it's this notion of outlasting the West, probably outlasting even the patience of Trump, which we know is really not there. However, that said, of course, there are big variables also on that side for Russia. So we all remember, of course, the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers in the Afghan campaign, which effectively put a ceiling on the campaigning there because of the casualties. The difference, it seems to me, at the moment is that was a sort of mothers group of civil society activists. That doesn't really exist in Russia at the moment, but there will potentially come a time when those veterans who were contract soldiers say that the special military operation is really achieving very little. The villages which are being captured are there for marginal gains against very high casualties, and that is a danger for Putin, particularly in the caveat on his ability to mobilize manpower. So of course he can probably sustain 35,000 contract soldiers coming in each month. What he can't do is probably have that figure that you mentioned of a mass type of mobilization, because the civil society and societal pressures that would put on Putin and Russian society would probably mean that could be a position or a posture where Putin might find himself in trouble at home.
No, when people talk about the attritional side of warfare and how this is an attritional battle, they tend to forget that the attrition is also in the political capital that's behind it as much as it is on the tactical issues that are there. But going down a rabbit hole for a second, you're looking at the lessons that are coming out of this. A lot of Western militaries, modern militaries, and I suppose Southeast Asian militaries, the Chinese will be looking at it very closely indeed, are looking at all the lessons that are coming out, and papers are appearing left, right, and centre trying to work out how we're going to adopt and adapt in the future. And was reading War on the Rocks on the train on the way down this morning, and there's a paper in there by a General Admiral. I had to reread that again. His surname was Admiral, called Steel in the Storm, Recent Wars as Guides for Armor Transformation. And he's looked at the conflicts in Ukraine, Israel, and Nagorno-Karabakh, and highlights the susceptibility of poorly employed or outdated armored forces, but then comes to the conclusion that if you've got armored forces fighting in the way that they're designed to fight from an all arms perspective, with all the bells and whistles that it'll need, including some new ones that are coming out as lessons, then armor still has a place on the battlefield. What do you think?
Well, I would go back to JFC Fuller, his theory of war in 1923, that for every action on the battlefield, there's a reaction. There's always a trade-off between the sword and the shield. There are some people who say that the future of warfare is drones. There are other people who say it's already yesterday's warfare and it's going to be surmounted by the EW will take care of that, the control of the electromagnetic spectrum, and so it's had its day. Now, of course, there are those wars that you quoted are significant for some of the lessons that people drew from that. The first one, Nagorno-Karabakh, was the first war when the majority of sustained casualties and armored casualties in particular were done from unmanned systems from the air. The second war, actually, it's not the second war, the Operation Guardian of the Walls of 2021 Israeli operation to Gaza, not against Hamas, but against Palestinian Islamic Jihad, was called the first AI war, when the power of machine learning allied to satellite power was a force multiplier, which allowed the Israelis to see almost what was happening in real time. When you'd pop up with a missile and it would get zapped about 3 seconds later. It seems to me that is the more important thing at the high end, that it's that fusion of AI, machine learning, and space power, which may be more impactful ultimately than drones. And probably it might be the development of laser technology, for example, in the next 2 or 3 years, which would take the place of air defense systems against sort of drones. So it is that sword versus the shield, where you need clever science to see where that trade-off should be. And that, of course, is the difficulty in procurement in the future, about you want to sort of force structure an organization where you have the least fewest regrets when the crisis hits. And it's always difficult to know that, and what is really a legacy system and what is not. I think you're right that employing things in the all arms environment with effect together is, of course, the way you need to go. If there's a weak part, in the sword or the shield, that will be exposed. Indeed, in the same way that when we were talking about the multiple strikes, drone strikes on Kyiv and things like that, we've always talked, as you know, Philip, about central gravities and central gravity analysis, the source of everyone's strength. Well, if you do a proper center of gravity analysis, you look at capabilities, requirements, and vulnerabilities. And of course, you should always attack through those vulnerabilities. That's what both sides are seeking to do at the moment. The Russians, by using their glide bombs against the front line, and the Ukrainians by the increasing innovation in the way they're doing drone warfare, allied to precision targeting.
How do we bring this innovation into our regular military psyche and thinking? It's great when you're in conflict because you're forced to do it, as we found you're during the Second World War and every time. But professional militaries, should they be training to bring innovation into front line? Is it something that's possible in peacetime?
I'm not sure it can be as agile in peacetime as it can be in war. I mean, war is the greatest laboratory of experimentation, and where you can get absolute agility in terms of responsiveness in the way that you potentially can't in a peacetime structure. I mean, that's the trick to try and go to when you're in a period of not quite war. And the best way to do that, of course, is to make sure that you have deterrence by denial, by having not necessarily force structure, but the capabilities within an alliance which can provide its own force multiplier against an enemy force. And that's why, in terms of all the timelines that people have quoted about the revanchist Russia attacking NATO countries. You can pick a number, but I personally believe that, rather like Montgomery said in 1951, the test match is postponed indefinitely due to the deterrent effect of the NATO alliance. I still think that's true when fully mobilized.
Yes, when fully mobilized and fully resourced. And NATO has, thank goodness, been forcibly woken up to try and increase its capability to what it said it had, but could never sort of properly field. But getting back into Ukraine now, President Trump put a 50-day peace ultimatum out there. It gives Putin another 50 days to influence him. But UK and Germany are now spearheading, after the Ukraine contact group meeting on Monday, spearheading a 50-day drive to arm Ukraine. What specific capabilities do you think that UK and Germany can get to Ukraine in that 50-day period of time? What does that match what Ukraine really needs? And do you think it's going to make a tangible difference?
Well, I think the shopping list has always been consistent from Zelensky, and what he's always required is a consistency of supply and a numerical consistency of supply and a regularity of supply. It's no secret that at the high end, it's the ballistic missile threat which is doing most of the damage. So it's that consistency of the high end Patriots in particular, even if that's NATO buying it from the Americans. What would be really useful in terms of the deep battle is ensuring that if they had something like Tomahawk cruise missiles that would extend the range to something like 1,200 kilometers. We won't find out from the Germans if Chancellor Merz has given Taurus missiles. That is not going to be announced publicly. That would potentially be a game changer, not because of the range, but because the technology of the Taurus is slightly different. That would potentially give the Ukrainians at a time and place that it's choosing the potential, if they wanted it, to take down the Kerch Bridge, which might be something which would put Putin on the horns of a dilemma, because it would almost have Crimea as something that might wither on the vine, very difficult to resupply. That might put him under real pressure. So it's that mix of range and capability plus the air defense, which are the two great things that Ukraine really needs, and they need them in numbers, because as we've seen, the intensive aerial assaults, they're increasing in number. You don't need Patriot missiles to take down Shahed 136s, but you need a consistency of the layered air defense that comes underneath Patriot to ensure you can knock as many of those down as possible. I think one of the good things which is happening is that the notion of joint US Ukrainian air defense production for the future gives the US a stake in this. But the potential fear is, of course, that within the 50 days of Trump, he might change his mind again. It's that old Trump changes, Trump never follows through. And you don't know, because that gives, I don't know how many days we've got left now. I think it's about 38. Putin could still get to him. There's a lot of time. It's back to Harold Wilson's notion that a week in politics is a long time. 38 days with Trump in his mercurial mind is absolutely a long time.
Well, it's also, it's 2nd of September, I think the 50 days is up. And secondary sanctions you're coming in, that would be against primarily China, India, and other countries that are accepting Russian goods. The EU, I understand, after the contact group meeting yesterday, have put additional sanctions on those countries, or they are sanctioning some of the companies in those countries that are accepting Russian goods. And then, of course, the EU has dropped the value of Russian oil from $60 a barrel down to $47.60 a barrel, which will impact Russia economically. So there seems to be a lot happening. And if I was President Zelensky and was going to use any Taurus missiles or other missiles, I think sometime before the 2nd of September would send the right message to Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table.
I think all that you said is sort of true, but I think a lot of it also comes with a caveat. The caveat for me is that there have been so many letters. That's why we're on, for example, in the EU package, the 18th round of sanctions. it is also the case, for example, that although 7 Russian banks have previously by the US been disconnected from the SWIFT system, there are certainly significant numbers that have not been, and that might well be the case with the whatever the package Trump comes up with. And indeed, there's a big difference, of course, between the executive and the legislature in terms of the package which Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal have proposed is 500% secondary sanctions as opposed to the 100% of President Trump, which may then be caveated again in certain terms in the way that he keeps changing his mind with the tariffs. And indeed, it was 100% tariffs was the term that Trump used a few days ago. So I'm not sure he actually knows what he means. And indeed, there's another interesting one, I think, in terms of it was only a few days before Trump made his announcement that Rubio was saying we don't really want to go down a large sanctions package because it might negate trying to get Russia to any form of ceasefire or negotiation. So again, you've still got a delta between those type of positions, which are almost articulated in a different way in a different week. And therefore, I think there's still a lot to play for. So I don't think there's any certainty. As we know, the only predictable thing about President Trump is his unpredictability.
Yes, well, that unpredictability. So finally, you're considering the events the last sort of 72 hours with the bombardments, the aid package, the upcoming peace talks in Istanbul, the grinding war of attrition. What's your overall assessment as where the current trajectory is? Are we seeing a decisive shift? Is there a new brutal phase, or are we in more of the same for the next X period of time?
No, I still think that the thing is really progressing at a glacial pace. I don't see this ending in 2025. I don't see an unlocking of any center of gravity through attacking weakness on either side. So, trying to raise the cost to each side is a fundamental thing to do. But do I see that being raised to a point where it will lead to negotiations which are equitable on both sides? No, I don't, at least for the next 3 to 4 months.
So on that note, General Chip, that's given us the excuse to call you back again and have another chat. So thank you very much indeed for chatting to me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.